Welcome to the Bible Weaver, where ancient words breathe again, and every whisper of Scripture becomes a living flame. There was once a kingdom unlike any other, not ruled by armies or crowns, but by trust. A master preparing for a long journey called his servants together. To each he gave something precious, not gold merely, but faith disguised as coin. He placed into their hands the weight of purpose, the quiet challenge of creation. One received 5 talents, another 2, another 1, each according to their ability, not as reward, but as invitation. And then the master departed, leaving behind silence and choice. The sun fell behind the hills, and with it, the certainty of direction. The servants stood together for a moment, holding the shimmer of the master's gift in their palms. The air was thick with expectation. The one with 5 looked toward the horizon, his eyes alive with possibility. The one with 2 turned the coins in his hand like seeds he wasn't sure how to plant. The one with 1 talent closed his fist around it, already afraid. Because fear is loudest when silence begins. The master had said nothing about how to use the gift, only that he would return. And so began the longest wait of their lives. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, a storm gathering far from the city. The servant with 5 talents stepped forward first, his heart quickened by purpose. He whispered, "If the master trusted me, then I will make his trust grow." And he went out into the fields to labor, his hands learning courage with every sunrise. The one with 2 watched him go. Doubt flickered behind his eyes like candlelight in wind. "Can my little matter?" he wondered. Then he remembered the master's gaze, not stern but steady, and something within him steadied too. He followed, not out of ambition, but out of love for the one who had believed in him. The last servant stood alone beneath the fading light. He felt the coin heavy in his palm, as though it burned through his skin. He feared loss more than failure, judgment more than growth. So he knelt and dug into the earth, burying the silver beneath layers of dust. He pressed the dirt flat and whispered, "At least it will be safe." But heaven never asked for safety. It asked for faith. The night came. The stars appeared like promises waiting to be kept. And in the quiet between breaths, the earth held its secret. 1 coin sleeping, 2 hearts rising, and 1 kingdom waiting to see what faith would become. He rose before dawn. The air was cool, still heavy with mist that clung to the edges of the fields. In his hand, the 5 talents gleamed faintly, small suns waiting to be awakened. He knelt, letting the silver catch the first light of morning, and whispered, "Let it grow." It was not a command. It was a prayer. He began where his hands knew best, the soil. He bought a field, barren and stubborn, and worked it until his palms bled. Each seed he sowed felt like a promise returned to the master who had trusted him. The villagers mocked him at first. "You risk too much," they said. "Keep what you have before you lose it." But he only smiled, sweat glistening on his brow. "Faith," he said, "is the one thing that multiplies when spent." Seasons turned. The storms came. The crops failed once, twice, but he did not stop. Every time he fell, he rose with the same quiet fire. He learned the rhythm of patience, the sound of purpose in the wind. Slowly, the earth began to yield. Grain sprouted where there had been dust. Vines curled upward from the broken soil. The people who once doubted now came to buy from his harvest. He traded wisely, gave generously, built steadily. And though his hands grew rough and his body weary, his heart grew light. For he understood now that the talents were not coins. They were chances to reflect the heart of the giver. One night, as he stood among his storehouses, listening to the rustle of grain, he felt something shift within him. He looked at the wealth around him, not the silver, but the growth, the lives his work had touched, and said softly, "This is not mine. I am only the keeper of another man's hope." He set aside a portion of his gain for the poor, leaving baskets at the edges of his fields for those who hungered. No trumpet announced it, no hand praised it. But the heavens saw, and somewhere beyond the stars, the master smiled. By the 5th year, his 5 talents had doubled, yet the servant felt no pride, only peace, because in the act of creating he had been created anew. He still remembered the look in the master's eyes the day he left, that silent faith that had asked for nothing but return in kind. And he vowed, when he comes again, he will find not only silver returned, but a soul that learned to shine. The wind moved gently through the grain, whispering across the field like a blessing. In its sound, the servant heard something more, the faint echo of footsteps, far away, as if the master had already begun his journey home. He did not move as quickly as the first, nor dream as boldly. His 2 talents fit easily in one hand, yet when he closed his fingers around them, they felt heavier than stone. He walked to the edge of his small vineyard and stood among the twisted vines. "What am I to do with this?" he whispered. The wind through the leaves offered no answer, only the quiet breath of the earth waiting to be stirred. He was not a man of ambition, but of patience. He began with what he knew, pruning, planting, watching. While others sought profit, he sought purpose. Each dawn he went out to the fields, turning soil until the sun burned his neck. The work was humble, the progress slow, but the rhythm of the labor became prayer. When he watered his vines, he prayed. When he shared his bread with the poor beside the gate, he prayed. Slowly, without him knowing, the prayer itself began to multiply. Years passed, marked not by coin but by fruit. The vineyard thickened, the clusters heavy with sweetness. Neighbors came to buy his wine, and he charged only what they could pay. When a drought struck, he opened his stores and poured for all who thirsted. "It will not last forever," one warned. "Neither will I," he answered, "but the gift will." In time, his 2 talents became 4, not only in trade, but in lives touched. The widow whose field he helped restore, the orphan who now worked beside him, the stranger who found shelter in his shade. These were his true earnings. At night, when he sat beneath the vines, he would look up at the stars and imagine the master returning. He did not picture judgment, but joy, the joy of seeing his trust fulfilled. He would whisper, "I was small, Lord, but I did not bury what you gave." The vineyard swayed gently in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, the same sound that had marked the master's departure. He smiled. "Perhaps," he said softly, "that is his voice drawing near." He slept beneath the vines that night, the earth warm beneath him, the air thick with the scent of ripened fruit. And in his dreams, he saw the master walking the road home, his shadow long, his face radiant with expectation. He waited until the others were gone. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the wind. Alone, he stood in the quiet courtyard, the single talent hidden in his fist, like a secret he wished he had never been given. He turned it over and over in his palm, feeling its cold edge press against his skin. The weight of it frightened him. He feared the master's eyes, the judgment in them, not for failure, but for imperfection. Better to do nothing, he thought, than to do something wrong. Better to return the coin untouched than risk losing what little he had. Fear whispered this logic into his ear, gentle as poison, so he listened. He walked to the far edge of his small garden, to the spot where the earth was soft and the roots shallow. There he knelt, dug a hollow with trembling hands, and placed the coin inside. He covered it quickly, pressing the dirt flat until no trace remained. Safe, he murmured, though his heart knew it was a lie. Safety and faith do not live in the same house. Days passed, then months. The others worked, sweated, dreamed. He watched from afar. Their courage unsettled him. He told himself they were reckless, that they misunderstood the master's will. The wise man preserves, he said aloud to the empty air. But even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. Sometimes, at night, he thought he heard the buried coin calling faintly, not with sound, but with memory. You were meant to grow me, it seemed to say. He would rise in the dark and walk to the garden, staring at the place where he had buried his trust. The soil looked peaceful, but it felt heavy, like guilt. Seasons turned. The garden yielded nothing but weeds. Each day the servant grew a little smaller inside himself, like a man shrinking from his own reflection. Fear had done what theft never could. It had stolen his soul's courage. He began to dream of the master's return. In his sleep, he saw eyes that looked not angry, but wounded. Disappointed love heavier than wrath. He would wake in sweat, whispering, "I will dig it up tomorrow." Yet the sun would rise, and he would not move. The years hardened around him like clay. And so when the rumors began that the master was coming home, his heart sank like a stone in water. He went to the garden at dawn, knelt by the old place, and began to dig. The earth was stubborn now, clinging to the coin as if trying to keep it hidden. When he pulled it free, the metal no longer shone. It was dull, tarnished, cold. It had been safe, yes, but untouched by life. He held it up to the light and whispered, "This is what fear gives back." The road outside was stirring. The first servant's laughter echoed faintly down the wind, full of joy and triumph. The second hummed a harvest song. The servant of one closed his hand over the coin again, but this time it felt heavier than before. Like a judgment he could no longer escape. The day came when the horizon burned gold. The servants had almost stopped expecting him. Yet every heart felt the tremor in the air before he appeared. Dust rose along the distant road like the breath of something ancient stirring again. Then a figure emerged, tall, robed, moving with the quiet certainty of one who owns both journey and destination. The master had returned. Word spread quickly through the village. Children ran to the gates, calling out. Old men left their work to watch. Those who had waited in faith felt their pulse quicken. Those who had hidden in fear felt the world narrow. The servant of five was the first to see him clearly. He bowed low, trembling not from fear but from joy. His fields were ripe, his hands calloused, his spirit ready. He took the doubled talents in his arms and stepped forward. Behind him, the servant of two walked more slowly, eyes bright with quiet gratitude, and far behind them, the servant of one carried a single coin wrapped in cloth, his face shadowed. When they stood before the master, he said nothing at first. His eyes went from one to the next, not judging but measuring, not their wealth but their hearts. The silence was heavy, sacred. Then he spoke, and his voice was both thunder and tenderness. "Show me what you have done with what was mine." The first servant knelt, unwrapping the silver that shone like morning water. "Master," he said, his voice steady, "you gave me 5. Behold, I have gained 5 more." The master looked upon him and smiled. "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your Lord." The servant bowed deeply, tears catching in his beard. He felt the words not as reward, but as recognition, the echo of purpose fulfilled. Then came the servant of 2. His offering was smaller, yet his hands trembled the same. "Master," he said softly, "you gave me 2 talents. I have gained 2 more." The master's eyes warmed. "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your Lord." The servant's heart lifted like a child's. He realized that the joy was not measured by the sum, but by the sincerity. The same words for both, the same grace for all who had dared to grow. Then silence fell again. The third servant stepped forward, the one who had buried his gift. The air grew tight, the light dimmed. He knelt slowly, holding out the small cloth. "Master," he said, his voice brittle, "I knew you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter. So I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the earth. Here, what is yours?" He opened the cloth. The coin lay there, dull and lifeless, untouched by time yet untouched by faith. The master looked down at it for a long moment. When he spoke, his tone carried no anger, only sorrow. "You knew I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I have not scattered. Then you should have at least placed my silver with those who trade. At my coming, I would have received what was mine with interest." The servant's eyes filled with dread. The coins seemed to burn between them, cold fire in the fading sun. "You wicked and slothful servant," the master said softly. "You feared loss, but in your fear you lost the one thing that mattered, faith." He turned to the others. "Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." The servant fell to his knees, trembling. But no thunder struck, no wrath fell, only the quiet truth that fear had already been his punishment. As the sun set, the master's voice softened again. "I gave you trust, and you buried it. I gave you breath, and you buried it in silence. I asked for faith, and you offered safety. Tell me, which of us was the harsher master? I who trusted you, or you who never trusted yourself?" The servant could not answer. The road behind the master glowed with twilight, and the sound of doves filled the air. Judgment had been spoken, but so had mercy, for even in rebuke, the master's eyes still held a trace of mourning love. He turned, and his robe brushed the ground where the buried coin had slept. Dust lifted like breath, the sign of something ending and something beginning. When the master departed again, silence lingered behind him like smoke after fire. The 3 servants stood beneath the weight of his words, each one changed, though in different ways. The first and second felt, their hearts alive with purpose, like seeds caught in sunlight. The third knelt alone, staring at the bare patch of earth where his fear had once been buried. Faith and fear had both been tested that day, and faith had proven the stronger master. The one who had 5 talents did not rejoice over the 10 that now filled his hands. Instead, he fell to his knees in the quiet of his own heart. He whispered, "It was never mine to keep." He had labored, traded, and risked, but the increase had not been born of skill. It had come from courage, from the willingness to move when no light showed the way. He realized that faith was not certainty. Faith was motion. Faith was choosing to act in the shadow before dawn, trusting that light would find you in the doing. The second servant walked beside him, silent, the dust warm beneath their feet. "The master's joy," he said softly, "was not in what we made, but in that we tried." The first nodded. "Yes," he replied, "for every act of faith is its own harvest." Behind them, far off, the third servant still lingered near the garden. His coin lay heavy in his palm. He turned it, studying the dull metal, and for the first time saw himself reflected faintly in its surface. The reflection frightened him. He had become what he had feared, empty, still, safe but lifeless. He looked at the ground, then at the sky, and something inside him broke. A small sound, the cracking of pride, the shattering of excuses. He whispered, "I buried what could have become light." The wind answered with a sigh of leaves, gentle but unrelenting, as if creation itself mourned what might have been. He closed his eyes and began to weep. For the first time, his tears touched the earth where he had hidden his trust. The soil softened, and a small green shoot pushed through, a fragile stem, trembling in the breeze. He stared at it, astonished. Something had grown after all, not by his doing, but by grace that refuses to let even buried things stay dead forever. He pressed the coin beside the sprout and whispered, "If you will still have me, teach me to begin again." Faith, it seemed, could return even to those who had lost it. And so, while the others built and planted, he tended that single green life. Day after day, he watered it with humility and watched it reach for the light. It was not a vineyard or a storehouse, but a beginning, a second chance. In time, he would understand what the Master had meant all along, that heaven measures growth not by gain, but by the courage to trust again after failing. The garden where he had buried the coin became his altar. Each morning, he rose with the sun and knelt beside the small green shoot that had dared to rise from his shame. The air was cool, damp with dew, and the soil beneath his fingers felt alive. He no longer counted days or measured yield. He only tended quietly, faithfully. At first, he expected the others to mock him, the servant who had failed, but none came. The first and second had gone far into the Master's lands, building, giving, creating. The third remained behind, learning what it meant to grow without being seen. The silence that had once haunted him became his teacher. He realized that fear had not been the Master's enemy. It had been his own. The voice that had whispered caution, that had dressed cowardice as prudence. It was still there, but softer now. Each time it spoke, he answered aloud, "Not this time." The plant grew taller, its roots reaching deeper. Birds nested in its branches. Travelers passing by would pause, resting in its shade, never knowing what story lay beneath its roots. He shared his bread with them, poured water from his jar, and found himself smiling again. One day, as he sat beneath the leaves, an old woman approached, weary from the road. He gave her what food he had, and when she asked why he was so generous, he said, "Because I once buried what was meant to grow. Now I give before I lose again." She looked at him with gentle eyes and whispered, "Then you have learned the Master's joy." Her words struck him like sunlight through cloud. The Master's joy. Not wrath, not disappointment. Joy. The same joy he had once thrown away through fear now found him again through kindness. He closed his eyes and felt something open in his chest. A quiet peace, deeper than any gain. He realized that his small act of tending, of giving, was its own talent multiplied. Heaven had taken what he buried and turned it into mercy. Seasons passed. The small plant became a tree, its fruit golden and sweet. He gathered what fell and gave it to those who hungered. The road travelers began to call it the tree of trust. Sometimes in the cool of evening, he thought he saw a figure walking along the horizon. A familiar silhouette, patient and kind. He would rise, heart trembling, wondering if the Master had returned again. But each time, the vision faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves. Still, he knew now, the Master's presence was not far away. It lived in the faithfulness of each day, in the soil of obedience, in the roots of small beginnings. And so, when others spoke of loss, he smiled and said, "Even buried things can rise. Time, like faith, grows quietly." Years slipped across the land, like wind over wheat. The three servants, once bound by one master's trust, now lived scattered across the kingdom. Yet their choices, faith, courage, repentance, wove unseen threads that would shape the generations after them. The servant of 5 built schools in the villages he once traded with. He taught children not only to plant and harvest, but to dream. The world, he told them, is a field for faith. What you plant and trust will bloom in its own season. His words traveled farther than his trade ever had. The servant of 2 turned his vineyard into refuge. The poor gathered under his vines, eating freely from fruit they did not plant. Travelers called his home the house of joy. He never wrote his name upon a gate, but his kindness etched it on every heart that passed through. And far away, the servant of one tended his tree, the one that had risen from the soil of regret. Its roots were thick now, its shade wide. He no longer called himself the servant who failed. To the children who came to play beneath its branches, he was simply the old man who gave fruit to anyone who asked. One evening, a traveler stopped by the tree and offered a silver coin in gratitude. The old man smiled and pushed it back into the traveler's hand. "No," he said gently. "If you want to repay me, plant something with it." The traveler laughed. "What good can one coin do?" The old man's eyes glimmered with quiet light. "You'd be surprised what buried things can become." And so, the coin left his hand, not hidden this time, but sent forth to live again. Years later, when the master's servants had long passed, the kingdom itself changed. New rulers came, new generations rose. Yet in every corner, whispers of their deeds remained. The schools, the vineyards, the trees, each bore the same unseen mark, the sign of trust, fulfilled. It was said that when travelers walked the kingdom's roads at sunset, they could hear faintly in the wind the same voice that had once spoken to those servants. Well done. Faith had multiplied beyond measure, not in silver, but in souls. The master's gifts had become a living legacy, carried not by memory, but by motion. Every time someone gave, created, forgave, or dared again after failure, the story breathed anew. Because what began as a parable of talents had become the heartbeat of the kingdom itself. Heaven's wealth was never coin, it was courage, compassion, and creation. Years passed into stories and stories into legend. The master's name faded from the tongues of men, but his deeds remained, woven into the lives of those who had once served him. Yet kingdoms do not last forever, and even the memory of faith can dim beneath the dust of comfort. One morning, beneath a sky washed pale with dawn, a caravan approached the old estate. At its head rode a young man, his cloak lined with gold thread, his hands soft, his eyes restless. He was the master's son, heir to the house, heir to the legend. But what he inherited in name, he had not yet inherited in heart. He dismounted before the gate, the same gate his father had once walked through in humility. The servants bowed. The air was still, holding the weight of things long unspoken. The young man looked upon the estate with mixed awe and indifference. "So this," he said, "is what I've been given." Inside, the halls were quiet. Portraits of his father lined the walls, eyes painted with the depth of one who had known both sorrow and joy. The son looked away. He had grown in a city where wealth was measured by glitter, not grace. His heart, though full of inheritance, was empty of gratitude. That night, as he dined in the hall where his father had once blessed the servants, an old steward approached him. The man's hair was white, his hands lined with years of labor. He bowed low and said softly, "My lord, your father left something for you." He handed the young man a sealed letter. The wax bore the imprint of the master's ring. The son broke the seal with impatience, but as he read, his breath slowed. "My son, if these words find you, then I have gone to a place where faith no longer needs sight. I leave you this house not for comfort, but for calling. All that you see, the vineyards, the fields, the tree beyond the walls, are the fruit of trust, not coin. Guard them not as treasure, but as testimony. For what is given to you is not wealth, but responsibility. Remember this: the kingdom is built not by those who keep, but by those who give. And when fear whispers that you might lose everything, remember that I too trusted you before I saw your faith." The son read the words again, slower this time. Something inside him stirred, not understanding, not yet conviction, but the faint ache of awakening. He looked toward the window, where moonlight spilled across the courtyard. In the distance, he saw it, the great tree his father had planted years ago, the one villagers still called the Tree of Trust. He rose and walked outside, the letter still trembling in his hand. The night was deep and fragrant with fruit. Beneath the branches, he found a stone, engraved faintly by time. The words were worn, but legible. Even buried things can rise. He knelt beside it. The ground was soft, cool beneath his palms. He thought of the father he had barely known, the man who had seen beyond the fear of losing, who had believed that the smallest faith could move the weight of the world. The son whispered, "I have inherited everything, yet I have earned nothing." For the first time, he did not feel like a master. He felt like a servant standing on holy ground. The wind moved through the branches, gentle and alive. In the hush of that night, he heard what felt like a voice, the echo of generations. Faith is not kept, it is continued. He stayed there until dawn, the first light painting his face with the warmth of a beginning. When the sun broke the horizon, he rose, his eyes clear. The heir had found the inheritance his father truly meant him to have. Not a kingdom of land, but a kingdom of purpose. The morning after the letter, the estate awoke to a different silence. It was not the stillness of emptiness, but of something waiting. The young heir rose before the servants, still holding the words his father had written. Outside, the first rays of sun painted the fields gold. The same fields his father had walked now called to him, like an echo from the past. He walked to the courtyard where the old steward awaited. "My lord," the steward said gently, "your father left instructions for one more season, a new venture left unfinished. He said it was to be yours." The heir frowned. "What kind of venture?" The steward led him to a small chest. Inside were 3 small bags of silver, sealed in wax. "He left this," the steward said. 3 measures, 3 chances. He said you would know what to do." The heir stared at the silver. It seemed almost alive under the sunlight. He felt the weight of his father's faith pressing upon him. For a moment, the old voice of fear returned, the one that said, "Keep it safe, do nothing, avoid loss." But then another voice rose within him, the one that had spoken through the letter, "Guard not as treasure, but as testimony." He called 3 servants. They knelt before him in the same courtyard where the first servants once had, centuries before, and without knowing it, history began to repeat itself. To the first, he gave 5 coins. "Use these to build something that lasts." To the second, he gave 2. "Use them to bless others." To the third, he gave 1. "Use it with courage, not fear." When the servants rose and departed, the heir remained alone. He looked at his hands, empty now, yet full of purpose. "So this," he whispered, "is what it feels like to trust." Days turned into weeks. The first servant invested boldly, the second shared wisely, and the third hesitated. The heir watched quietly from a distance, remembering the story he had once read of his father's own trial. He began to see the truth that the master's test was never about silver. It was always about the heart that held it. He visited the villages, spoke with workers, listened to those who had been forgotten. The more he gave, the lighter he felt. He rebuilt walls in dry lands, restored roads that had crumbled. The people began to see him, not as an heir, but as a shepherd. But not all approved. Among the advisors of his court were those who served gain, not grace. "My lord," they said, "you waste your wealth on peasants. Your father built a legacy of order. You risk turning it into ruin." He looked at them and said softly, "My father built a legacy of faith. I am only keeping it alive." They whispered among themselves, "He is young. He will learn." But the heir had already learned the one lesson his father wanted him to, that what is hoarded decays, but what is given becomes eternal. The season ripened. The first 2 servants thrived. The third still wavered. The heir watched him from afar, torn between patience and fear. He knew too well the weight of that hesitation, for it was once his own. Then came word that drought had struck in the outer villages. The crops were failing, and hunger was spreading. The heir gathered his council and said, "We will open the storehouses. What we have, we will share." Gasps filled the hall. "Share the master's reserves?" One shouted. "You will drain your inheritance." The heir smiled, calm and certain. "Then let it drain into the hands of the living." For the inheritance was never meant to stay within walls. That night, he walked alone into the courtyard again, under the branches of the great tree. The moonlight fell through its leaves, scattering silver across the earth. He thought of his father, of the servants who had come before, of the seed that had once been buried in fear and risen in grace. He whispered, Now, Father, let me prove worthy of the gift. And the wind stirred, a low, steady whisper, carrying through the branches as if the heavens themselves approved. The drought deepened. The rivers shrank into ribbons of dust, and the wind carried the dry cry of the earth across the kingdom. Every field seemed to thirst for the faith of its keeper. The air sent out provisions, food and water from the master's storehouses. He labored beside his people, his robe stained with dust and sweat. And yet, in the shadow of his generosity, one man still chose fear. The servant who had received the single coin lingered far from the estate. He was young, uncertain, his hands more used to counting than creating. When the heir had first placed the coin in his palm, he had felt the same tremor that once shook the first servant of one, that ancient quiet terror of not being enough. He had hidden it in his coat, whispering, "I will wait until the time is safe." But time, like soil, is never safe for seeds that are not sown. As the weeks passed, the drought worsened, and the need for faith grew heavier. Messengers returned with tales of generosity, of the first two servants who had turned their gifts into water, into bread, into life. Their works spread hope across the land, and every story pressed deeper into the conscience of the one who did nothing. He began to wake in the night, hearing the whisper of his buried trust. It was not the coin that haunted him, but the memory of the heir's eyes, kind, patient, believing. "He trusted me," the servant whispered to the dark. "He believed I could." He dug up the coin before dawn. The earth resisted him, as if ashamed to reveal his secret. When at last he held it in his palm, it looked smaller than before, lighter, almost hollow. He brushed away the dirt and wept. "What have I done with what was living?" He wrapped the coin again in cloth and set out for the estate. The road was long and empty. His feet blistered, his lips cracked, but his guilt drove him faster than thirst. He arrived at sunset, just as the heir was finishing his day's labor among the workers. Falling to his knees, the servant placed the cloth before him. "My lord," he said, his voice shaking, "I was afraid. I thought to keep what was yours, but I lost what was mine." The courage to try. The courtyard grew silent. All eyes turned to the heir. For a moment, he said nothing, only looked at the trembling figure before him. Then he knelt down, not in anger, but in understanding. He reached out, placed his hand over the servant's, and whispered, "You are not the first to fear." The servant looked up, tears streaking the dust on his cheeks. "Then what will become of me?" he asked. The heir smiled softly, though sorrow touched his eyes. "That depends on what you do next. Faith is not a gift buried in the ground. It is a door, and it opens only when you move." He pressed the coin back into the servant's palm. "Begin again. The kingdom still waits for your courage." The servant bowed his head, unable to speak. He felt the warmth of mercy in his hand, heavier than the coin itself. That night, he returned to the road, not to hide, but to work. He gave the coin to a woman selling seeds and said, "Plant something for me." She looked at him, confused. "What kind of seed?" He smiled faintly. "The kind that grows faith." And in that moment, the curse of fear broke its hold, and a buried soul began to rise. The woman took the coin and bought seeds, small pale things that looked like nothing, lighter than dust. She scattered them into the cracked ground outside her hut, not knowing why, only that the man's trembling voice had moved her. "The kind that grows faith, he had said. And so she planted. The rains did not come that week, nor the next. Yet every dawn she watered the soil with what little she could spare, whispering, "Let this be enough." The neighbors mocked her. "No seed lives in this heat," they said. But she kept tending, because to stop would mean to agree with the despair. One morning, when the sky was still the color of ash, she stepped out and gasped. A single green shoot had broken through the earth, fragile yet defiant. It swayed in the wind, thin as a thread of hope. She dropped to her knees and began to cry. The tears fell onto the soil, and she whispered, "So, this is faith." Word spread through the village, a sprout alive in the drought. People came to see it, touched it, brought water to pour upon its roots. The dry ground, long starved of mercy, began to soften. Within weeks, more green pushed through. First grass, then blossoms, then grain. The air changed. The fields shimmered with the first hint of harvest. The servant who had given the coin returned months later. Where he expected dust, he found gold, waves of wheat bending in the wind. The woman met him with tears in her eyes. "Your coin did this," she said. "No," he whispered, kneeling in the field. "Your faith did." Behind them, a crowd had gathered. Children ran laughing through the stalks. Men and women filled baskets with the first fruit. The servant looked towards the horizon and saw the air riding from the estate, his robe flowing in the wind. The people fell silent as he approached. When he saw the fields, the heir dismounted and stood among them, letting the grain brush against his fingers. "Who planted this?" he asked. The servant stepped forward, trembling. "It was the coin you gave me, my lord," he said. "I gave it to her, and she planted." The heir smiled, not proud, but full of something deeper. "Then you have learned the secret of the kingdom," he said, "that mercy multiplies faster than silver." He turned to the people. "This field will not be taxed. Let it feed those who hunger. Let it remind every soul who sees it that what is buried in faith will rise in abundance." The crowd cheered, but the servant could not speak. He felt his knees weaken as he looked at the harvest, each stalk a testament that the master's lesson had not died with time. The same story, told anew, now lived through him. That evening, when the sun sank and the air glowed red, he walked beside the heir in silence. Finally he asked, "My lord, do you think your father sees this?" The heir's gaze softened. "He does," he said quietly, "and he smiles, because what began in fear has become faith again." The road continues. They stood together as the last light faded over the golden fields. Two servants of different generations bound by the same truth, that the smallest act of trust can feed a kingdom. The miracle spread faster than the wind. The harvest from one forgotten village became the talk of an entire province. Travelers carried the tale in wagons and whispers, from markets to temples, from taverns to palaces. Each told it differently, but the heart of it remained the same. A single act of trust had fed 1,000. Some said the soil had been blessed. Others said the air had called down rain. But the old woman always smiled and shook her head. "It was just a coin," she would say, and the courage to believe it could become something more. The story reached the ears of the proud and the weary alike. In distant cities, merchants began setting aside portions of their gain for the poor. In quiet monasteries, scribes copied the tale and wrote in their margins, "Mercy is the seed that never fails." Even soldiers marching through barren lands spoke of it by firelight. If the drought could end there, one said, Perhaps peace can begin here. The story had become a living thing, no longer bound to one place, but breathing in every heart that dared to believe that giving was stronger than keeping. One evening, a caravan of traders arrived at the estate. Among them was a man from a neighboring kingdom, known for his cunning and greed. He sought the heir not to learn but to measure. "Tell me," he said, "what profit do you gain from feeding the hungry? You pour out wealth, yet you demand no tribute. How does your kingdom grow?" The heir looked at him for a long moment, the firelight flickering in his calm eyes. "It grows," he said, "in ways your ledgers cannot record. For every heart that is fed becomes a hand that builds, and every life restored becomes a voice that blesses, not curses. The kingdom expands not by conquest, but by compassion." The merchant laughed. "Compassion does not fill storehouses." "No," the heir replied softly, "but it fills eternity." The merchant fell silent, unsettled by the weight of those words. For deep within, he knew that his own wealth had never brought him peace. That night, he lingered by the fields, staring at the rippling grain under the moonlight. He pressed a single coin into the soil before leaving, just to see if the story was true. Weeks later, as he crossed back through the land, he found the same spot shimmering with green. The sight undid him. He fell to his knees and whispered, "So faith was never about gain. It was about giving." The news of that moment traveled too. And so, across the lands, new gardens began to bloom. Small at first, then many. Each one started with a coin, a seed, a gesture. The people called them fields of mercy. In every market, in every square, children sang a song about the heir who gave, the woman who planted, the servant who learned. The refrain carried through the air like a prayer. What you give returns. What you keep decays. Mercy builds kingdoms that never fade. The heir would sometimes stand at his window at night, hearing the faint echo of that song carried by the wind. And though he never claimed the glory, he felt its truth, that his father's legacy had become a living voice, not in laws or monuments, but in hearts that had learned to trust again. The years moved gently, like a tide that carried both memory and mercy. The land had changed. The drought was gone, and in its place stretched fields of gold and green. But time has its own rhythm. It gives, it takes, and one day it brings the past back to your door. It was evening when the guards at the gate announced a visitor, an old man wrapped in a weathered cloak, leaning on a cane carved from olive wood. His hair was white as winter, his eyes dim yet unyielding. When the heir stepped out to greet him, the stranger's voice trembled, but the tone held authority, like one who had spoken with kings. "Do you remember me?" the old man asked. The heir frowned, studying his face. Then recognition flickered like dawn. "You were my father's steward." The old man smiled faintly. I was once the keeper of his trust, as you are now." He reached out, his hand trembling. "I have walked far to see what has become of his kingdom, and of you." The heir led him inside, seating him by the fire. The hall glowed with the warmth of lamplight and the hum of quiet life. The old steward looked around, nodding slowly. "Your father would be pleased," he said. "He left a house of faith. You have built a nation of it." The heir bowed his head. "I only tried to follow what he taught." The steward chuckled softly. "Ah, but that is the test, my son. The hardest part of any trust is to make it your own." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire Then the steward spoke again, his voice low and fragile. "Do you know what your father told me before he left for the last time?" The heir shook his head. He said, "They think I test them with silver, but I do not. I test them with themselves." The heir looked up, puzzled. The old man continued. He knew the talents were never about money. They were about image. He wanted to see in his servants a reflection of the one who gave all things, the master of masters, who gives without fear, who sows where others see no soil. He coughed softly, his hand gripping the cane, and he said something else. "If one day my son learns that giving is the only way to keep, then the kingdom will not end with me." The heir's throat tightened. "He spoke of me?" The steward nodded. "He believed the test would pass to you. He said every generation must face the same question. Will you bury what you've been given? Or will you let it live?" The fire flickered, shadows dancing across their faces. The heir looked into the flames, seeing not heat but history, the first servants, the fields, the tree that still stood outside, its branches now vast and strong. The old man leaned closer. "You have done well, my lord, but your test is not over. For faith that does not pass forward dies where it stands. Teach the next generation to trust as your father taught you." The heir took the old man's hand and said quietly, "I will." The steward smiled, his eyes glassy with light. "Then my journey is done." He closed his eyes, and in that moment his breath faded like a candle reaching its rest. The heir sat beside him, silent. No wailing, no fear, only peace, for the old man had spoken truth. Faith that he shared never dies. That night, the heir walked alone to the great tree. The moon bathed its leaves in silver. He placed his father's letter, now worn and creased, beneath its roots. "The trust continues," he whispered. "Your test lives in me." And the wind answered softly, lifting the leaves as though heaven itself breathed amen. The night after the steward's passing, the heir could not sleep. The stars hung low over the kingdom, quiet and solemn, as if heaven itself had paused to listen. He sat by the window of the master's old study, the same room where his father had once written letters of instruction and love. On the desk lay the steward's cane, his father's ring, and the coin that had started it all, now bright again, as if polished by time and tears. He held the coin between his fingers, feeling its cool weight. "It always returns," he whispered. "Every test, every trust." The words sounded like an oath. From the corridor, he heard soft footsteps. He turned to see a child standing in the doorway. A girl, no more than 12, her dark eyes curious and awake. "Father?" she asked. "Why are you still up?" He smiled faintly. "I was remembering a man who taught me what faith looks like." She padded closer, climbing onto his lap as she had when she was small. "Tell me the story," she said. "The one about her talents." He looked down at her, the light from the lamp gilding her face. "You've heard it before. I want to hear it again," she whispered. And so he began, slowly, softly, retelling the story of a master, his servants, the gifts given and the choices made. But this time, he told it differently. He told it not as history, but as inheritance. He spoke of courage, of the danger of safety, of how fear can bury the living heart of faith. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she asked, "Father, if I were given one talent, what would you want me to do with it?" He looked at her hands, small, unscarred, full of potential, and smiled. "I would want you to risk it," he said. "Not to keep it, not to hide it, to make it live." That's how the kingdom grows. She tilted her head. But what if I lose it? Then you'll find what it means to be found, he said softly. The only true loss is never to begin. Her eyes glistened. She reached for the coin in his hand, and he let her take it. She turned it over carefully, the metal glinting in the lamplight. It doesn't look like much, she said. He chuckled. Neither does a seed. That night, she kept the coin beneath her pillow, and as she drifted to sleep, she dreamed of a road winding through endless fields, and of a hand reaching down to plant something shining in the soil. When morning came, the air stood beneath the great tree outside. The sun poured gold through its branches. He held a steward's cane in one hand, and in the other, the ring of his father. He whispered to the wind, "Now it is her turn." The breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of blossoms. In that sound, he could almost hear the voices of those who had come before. The father, the servants, the steward, each one whispering the same eternal promise. The test must always return, but faith must always rise. And so, the circle began anew. Years unfolded like gentle waves upon the shore, carrying the young girl from childhood into the bright, uncertain edge of youth. The kingdom had prospered under her father's wisdom. Fields of mercy thrived, trade was honest, and the people spoke his name with reverence. Yet the heir's daughter felt something restless inside her, a call not toward power, but purpose. She often walked alone beyond the palace walls, down the same roads her grandfather had once traveled, past the vineyards, past the tree whose roots had split the stones. In her pocket, she still carried the coin her father had given her, the same coin that had passed through generations of faith. She would take it out at sunset, hold it up to the light, and whisper, "Show me what to do." One evening, as the sky burned crimson and violet, she came upon a village in distress. A storm had torn through days before, leaving homes collapsed and hearts weary. Children sat in the dust. Elders wept in silence. When she arrived, they did not recognize her as the daughter of the heir. They saw only a stranger with kind eyes and a single coin in her hand. She knelt beside a boy trying to rebuild a broken roof with his small hands. "What do you need?" she asked. "Everything," he said simply. She looked at the coin again. "Then perhaps this is a start." The villagers laughed gently. "A coin cannot rebuild a home," one said. She smiled. "It can buy a seed of hope, and hope, once planted, multiplies." She took the coin to a craftsman and asked him to melt it down. He hesitated. "It is pure silver, my lady." "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "Shape it into a tool, a spade, perhaps, something that can dig foundations." By dusk he returned with the finished piece, simple, shining, strong. She placed it in the boy's hands. "Begin here," she said. "Faith grows from what you do, not what you keep." Word spread quickly through the village. Others joined the rebuilding, not out of command but out of courage born from example. What began with one tool became many. What began with one home became a community reborn. When the work was done, they gathered to give thanks. The boy, now smiling through the dirt on his face, approached her. "We want you to take it back," he said, offering the spade. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It belongs here now. Just promise me one thing. When someone else is in need, lend it to them." He nodded solemnly. And thus, the silver that had once tested servants, kings, and generations became a tool passed from village to village, a symbol of action born from belief. Wherever it traveled, life followed. When the daughter returned to the palace, her father stood waiting beneath the tree. She held up her empty hands and said, "I gave the coin away." He smiled, tears glimmering in his eyes. "Then you've kept it in the only way that matters." That night, as the moon rose above the kingdom, father and daughter stood together in silence. The wind moved through the branches, carrying the faintest echo of the old master's voice, the same whisper that had begun everything long ago. "Well done, good and faithful servant. Peace, like the harvest, can make the heart forget that storms still exist." For many years, the land knew abundance. The daughter's kindness spread like rain. Schools, wells, and fields of mercy grew wherever her hands touched. But one summer, the wind changed. It began as whispers, rumors of revolt, envy in the hearts of those who had forgotten who first gave them seed. A famine struck the northern borders, and fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Traders accused the crown of hoarding. The same storehouses once opened in generosity were now guarded behind iron gates. Even the faithful began to doubt. Why does the Lord who multiplies mercy now send ruin? People murmured. When word reached the capital, the daughter was no longer a child. She rode out with a small band of helpers, the silver spade hanging from her saddle. "If the land has turned dry," she said, "then we must water it with compassion again." Her father, now old and weary, tried to stop her. "The roads are dangerous," he warned. "Faith can burn as quickly as it blooms." She smiled faintly. "Then let me be the ember that still glows." The journey north was long and cruel. Smoke rose from villages where anger had replaced need. In one town, stones were thrown at her party. "You have more than us," they cried. Her guards wanted to flee, but she dismounted, walked into the crowd and said, "Then take what we carry." She opened the wagons, grain, oil, cloth, and gave it all away. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then someone whispered, "She gives as her father gave." The crowd parted, shame washing over their faces. They began to help her distribute the food. By dusk, strangers had become workers again, and the fires of hunger had turned into fires of hope. But peace was fragile. Bandits followed her convoy, seeing her generosity as weakness. One night, under a blood-red moon, they attacked the camp. The guards fought, but they were outnumbered. The daughter was struck, her arm wounded as she tried to protect a child. The bandits fled when dawn came, leaving behind ruin and smoke. She lay weak, her blood staining the soil she had come to heal. Her father arrived days later, his hair white as ash, his eyes hollow. He knelt beside her, trembling. "Why?" he whispered. "You could have stayed safe." She smiled, faint but radiant, because faith was never meant to stay safe. He took her hand. "You gave everything." She closed her eyes. "Not everything. The seed still lives." And then she fell into stillness, her breath fading like wind through wheat. The air pressed his forehead against her hand. "Then let the seed rise again," he said through tears. That night, the sky broke open with rain. The famine ended. Across the northern fields, the first sprouts returned, green against the charred soil, as if the heavens themselves had wept her sacrifice into life. The people would later call her the daughter of the silver spade. And where she had fallen, they built a garden, one that never withered. Her father spent the rest of his days tending it, whispering to the wind. She did not die. She multiplied. The years that followed were quiet. The kingdom, once trembling between fear and faith, began to breathe again. Rain returned to the valleys, crops to the hills, and peace to the weary hearts of its people. Yet for the old heir, now a father who had buried his light, the world seemed wrapped in silence. He lived simply. The crown he once wore now gathered dust beside the steward's cane. Each morning he walked to the garden where his daughter had fallen, a place that had become both grave and sanctuary. The people had planted trees out there, one for every village she had helped, every well she had dug, every child she had saved. In the center of the garden stood the silver spade, half buried, its handle glinting softly in the light. He would kneel beside it each dawn, pressing his hand into the soil. "You still live here," he whispered. "Every root that grows carries your breath." Seasons came and went. The garden became a living cathedral. Birds nested in its branches, children played between its roots, and strangers came from distant lands just to sit in its peace. No one left without feeling changed. They said that the air there carried a stillness that healed the spirit, the same quiet that had once filled the master's court when trust was tested and found faithful. One spring, when the blossoms fell like pale snow, the old heir gathered the people in the garden. His hair was white now, his back bent, but his voice was steady. "You all know this place," he said. "You've called it holy. But listen to me, there is nothing magical in this soil. It is holy because love was buried here and refused to stay dead." He pointed to the silver spade. "This is what faith becomes when it stops being an idea and starts being a life. It digs, it bleeds, it plants, it weeps, and still it grows." A child raised his hand. "Will the garden ever die?" The old man smiled faintly. "Not while one heart still remembers to give." He turned then to the horizon, where the sun sank into gold. "My father once told me that faith was the only inheritance worth keeping. My daughter showed me it was the only one worth giving away." That evening, as twilight wrapped the trees in silver, he walked one last time through the rows of flowers. His breath came slow, but his eyes were bright. At the heart of the garden, he stopped beside the spade. Gently, he placed his father's ring upon its handle. "It returns to the beginning," he said softly. "The trust continues." He knelt, his hands sinking into the soil. "Tell her," he whispered to the wind, "that her garden stands." And as the last light faded, the wind rose, not harsh but warm. The blossoms lifted and spiraled through the air, falling like blessings on his shoulders. When the people found him at dawn, he was still kneeling, head bowed, a faint smile on his lips. Around him, new shoots had broken through the ground. They buried him beneath the tree where the first seed of mercy had been planted generations ago. And so the three, the master, the heir, and the daughter, were united not by blood alone, but by the circle of trust that never broke. In time, the garden became known as the Field of Faith. Pilgrims came from distant lands to walk its paths, carrying their own seeds, small, trembling, full of possibility. They would kneel in the soil and whisper, "Even buried things can rise." And always, in the hush that followed, it felt as though the earth itself answered, "Yes." They always do. Centuries drifted over the land like clouds, and still the garden stood. Empires rose and fell, kings were crowned and forgotten, but the field of faith endured. Its roots drank from a promise that time could not touch. The silver spade, dulled by rain and years, remained where it had always been, half buried, half shining, like the memory of heaven caught in the soil of earth. Travelers came from every corner of the world to see it. Some came out of curiosity, some out of despair. None left unchanged. They said the air there carried peace, not loud, not thunderous, but the quiet kind that settles in the bones. A farmer who lost everything would kneel there and find the courage to begin again. A widow would bring the last of her seed and plant it beneath the old trees. A child, hearing the story for the first time, would ask, who were they, the ones who started it all? The caretakers would answer softly, they were servants, and then a master, and then a daughter. But truly, they were all the same. They were people who chose to trust. Generations kept the garden alive. Each season, a new keeper would take the oath at dawn, to sow without fear, to give without measure, and to believe that mercy never dies. The oath was carved on a stone near the entrance, its letters weathered but legible. The kingdom is not built by those who keep, it endures through those who give. At night, the fields shimmered under moonlight. Locusts might come, wars might scar the land, but somehow the garden always healed. Scholars called it a mystery. The faithful called it a miracle. Yet for those who understood the story, it was neither. It was simply the harvest of one truth, the same truth that had echoed through generations of servants and kings alike. Faith that is lived becomes light. One evening, an old monk writing by candlelight looked up from his desk. He had been copying the tale of the talents, passed down through countless tongues. He paused, his quill hovering, and whispered, "So this is what the master meant." He dipped his pen again and wrote the closing line of his scroll. "The faithful do not die. They turn into the light that guides those who remain." Outside, the moon rose higher. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the scent of blossoms. In every corner of the kingdom, lamps flickered to life. One by one, thousands of small flames scattered across the darkness. To anyone watching from the hills, it looked as if the stars themselves had descended to the earth. And somewhere among those lights, a child held a small silver coin, the last remnant of the master's gift. Turning it over in her hand and whispering, "What can I do with this?" Her mother smiled and said, "You already have. You asked." The child smiled back. "Then maybe I'll plant it." The mother nodded. That's how all great things begin. And so, once more, the circle of giving began again. Not as legend, but as living truth. Because the light never belonged to any one generation. It was born in the giving, renewed in the trusting, and alive in every heart that dared to believe. What you sow in faith will rise in glory. Night folded gently over the field of faith. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of earth and blossom. The stars shimmered above like 1,000 watching eyes, ancient and kind. The last caretaker, an old woman with silver hair and hands scarred by planting, walked the paths alone. She had tended the garden all her life, though she had never seen the ones who began it. Their names were legend now, their stories half prayer, half memory. She stopped beside the silver spade, now green with age, and knelt. "You never stopped growing," she whispered to the soil. "Even after all of us forgot who first trusted you." She looked upward, her eyes catching the starlight. "Was it always this way, Lord? Have we always been planting what you first gave?" A hush settled over the garden. The air grew still, as if creation itself were listening. And then, in that stillness, a voice spoke, not from above, but from within. It was the kind of voice that does not reach the ears but the soul. It was never yours to keep and never theirs to begin. Every seed was mine. Every gift was a reflection of my own heart, placed in your hands to see if you would remember where it came from. She bowed her head, tears falling into the soil. We tried, she whispered. I know, the voice said. And that is all I ever asked. The stars seemed to draw closer. The garden glowed faintly, as if the ground itself remembered every act of mercy ever planted in its soil. The old woman saw for a fleeting moment figures walking among the trees, familiar and radiant. The master with his calm eyes, the servants who had labored and learned, the daughter holding the silver spade, her light gentle as dawn, and behind them, the generations that followed, each carrying a spark of faith that had never gone out. You see, the voice continued, I was never far from the garden. Every hand that gave was my own. Every field that grew was my breath returning to me. I am the master who gives, and the servant who sows, and the harvest that rises. The woman's breath trembled. Then the kingdom, the voice said, is not a place you reach. It is what happens whenever love refuses to end. Light unfolded from the horizon, soft and endless. The trees shimmered like flame without fire, every leaf whispering the same word, trust. The woman closed her eyes and peace filled her like the first dawn of creation. When she opened them again, the night was gone. The garden remained, bathed in golden light. A new caretaker, young, curious, full of wonder, walked the path, drawn by stories she barely believed. She knelt where the old woman had been, her hand brushing the earth. Will it grow again? She murmured. The wind stirred, warm and familiar, and somewhere within it a voice answered, gentle, eternal. It always does, and the light spread over the fields, over the mountains, over every heart that still carried a seed of faith. The story that began with a single coin had become the pulse of creation itself, God's own trust living within those who dared to believe. Because in the end, every servant, every master, every act of mercy had been part of one great truth, that the giver never stops giving, and the gift, once planted, never dies. Fade, wind through golden trees, distant choir rising, heartbeat blending into silence and light.